Hi, this is Jessica Henderson, Director of Science and Instruction Partners, and I am so happy to be talking today to Dora Kastel, Curriculum Development and Professional Learning Manager for Science for New Visions for Public Schools. And I'm
Long
so,
title.
you know what, an important title, a lot in there. And just so excited to have so much knowledge, expertise in this virtual room today. And of course, so excited to be able to add your science voice to this discussion that we've been having around rethinking intervention and also just what works when we think about the fullest potential of just students learning science. So, thank you so much for taking the time to sit and chat with me today, Dora. I truly appreciate it. And I want to start kind of personal. I just want to hear a story from your own journey about you as a learner. How have your experiences in formal school, informal learning, how have those things really worked to inform your perspective and the work that you do?
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here, Jessica. And yeah, I think working in education and teacher ed often has me reflecting on my own learning experiences in STEM in particular. And one of the things that comes to mind for me when you ask that question is my experience in math. As actually given, because I was thinking, like, is it, do I want to share a struggle or a success? And it's actually both that I'll share with you. Um, as a kid, I was always very good at math, and in in some ways, like math education, the way I grew up was very one size fits all. And it was like not that's really, it's more like the way they teach it is assuming that it's a one size fits all model. That's how I learned math. And the model happened to work for me as a learner, given my learning style, for a long time. Once I got to middle school, it stopped working because I was really bored. I was really not challenged. And I remember that was when I first started to separate accelerated classes for math in middle school. And even in the accelerated class, I remember being bored out of my mind, constantly thinking to myself, I could teach this lesson better than the teacher could teach this lesson. Like, and I would like every once in a while, like I was even allowed to teach, like to go over problems. I remember going to the front of the board. And in high school, similarly, I just like did fine in math. I constantly got good grades and I was bored. And I was like, oh, I'm going to be a math major one day. And then I got to college and I hit a ceiling and I nearly failed calculus. I had taken AP calculus in high school and I was immediately put into Calc 2 or whatever it was in my Ivy League school. And it was brutal. And I barely passed. I did not become a math major. And I realized that the lack of like conceptual approach, the
Mhm.
fact that I wasn't taught in a way that supported conceptual development meant I had all these like gaps and I could get away with being really successful because I knew how to do school. And that privilege of being able to do school worked for me for a really long time until it didn't. And it was like painful to learn that, and that attempt at a one size fits all approach might work for some kids and not other kids. It might work for some kids temporarily, but then stop working for those kids at some point. And it really has made me have a significant amount of buy-in to like foundational understanding, conceptual understanding in any discipline being more important than memorization or success on standardized testing, because that to me didn't show evidence that I actually understood what was happening. I did end up getting an advanced degree in math education. So one of my master's degrees is in science ed, the other is in math ed. And I did end up learning a lot of the stuff I never learned. And I did end up becoming both a math and a science teacher. Um, but I struggled much more as a math teacher than I did as a science teacher because of the lack of conceptual foundational understanding.
That idea is so interesting because it's really thinking around like what is success as a learner and like what do we define as success, and how like you can reflect on being so successful technically, right, in school until you hit that ceiling, until something else was necessary. And how do you think that that has, or that experience has really impacted like the type of work that you do or how you approach education?
Um, I definitely think it has affected it, certainly with regards to the new NGSS work that we've been doing the last few years. Really thinking about thinking about this idea around evidence of learning, and really focusing on when we're looking at standards and we're thinking about how are we going to make claims about what students know and can do, that that numbers, grades are not sufficient enough, that like simply attaching a number to something doesn't, or like multiple uh simplistic multiple choice answers to things aren't enough evidence to really make a true claim about what students know and can do. And so I definitely think that I would trace back to me thinking I understood everything and thinking I really got it because my grades were really good. But
Mhm.
when actually you scratch the surface, there's not a lot of depth.
Yeah.
Procedural understanding isn't enough.
And I love that idea that some students have the, I loved how you termed it, like the privilege of being able to do school well.
Yeah.
And w- a lot of the times as we think about is intervention in general and rethinking intervention and who we intervene on, a lot of those decisions are made by who does school well versus who does not do school well, and not
Yeah, that
what
highlights
you know.
systemic problems. This is a problem with the system, that we are rewarding the kids who do school well instead of the kids who understand and know things and can do those things, which isn't necessarily the same as doing school. And yeah, I do think I am now aware of that privilege that I had, um, being able to do school really well for a long time. Did not mean that I understood everything to the depth of maybe even my peers who didn't do school as well as I did.
Definitely, definitely something I can say amen to and agree with. Um, so, thinking about your experience in science education, what would you say that you know works in the job of advancing student learning in science? And if you could kind of tell us some things that you've seen in your own work that have really made you, I would say, champion that strategy or that approach, and what about that has actually helped to advance student learning in science? What would you say works for us?
So one of the most important things I think I learned, through the collaborative work I did when I was a classroom teacher with, the Urban Advantage program in New York City with the informal science institutions, but specifically the American Museum of Natural History. And then I ended up
Mhm.
working there for a while. One of the most important learnings I took away from that work was the importance of having science teachers in professional learning immerse in the kinds of learning being taught to them so that they can teach their students effectively. And so as we learn more, it's good to get meta here with you. As we learn more about what works, the researchers, the leaders who are trying to make shifts and positive shifts in science ed, in order to get the teaching force to get on board with that or to learn about it, it's not enough to evaluative or like judge them and say like, oh, you're not doing something right, like or just tell them how to do it better. The actual way to shift thinking, which is both true for students and teachers, is to actually have them live it and do it. So I think one of the biggest challenges with the most recent reform work around three-dimensional learning, phenomena-based driven instruction, has been for teachers who never learned in that way to experience it for themselves. And I've seen so much evidence every time, for years now, every time we do a workshop of any kind with a person who's new to this way of learning, as soon as they start to experience it for themselves, they immediately give feedback that's like, oh, this is what you're trying to do. This is going to be so great for the kids. This is incredible. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if my kids can do it, but I see the value in it and I see how important it is. Help me get there. And they need that immersive experience in order to like have those aha moments. I think that was the term I remember learning that as a teacher. What's an aha moment? And it's when you like, as a teacher in the PD, you're like, I get what it feels like to be my kids. I see the challenges, I'm experiencing them. Now I can think better as a teacher to support them with that. And we build that into the professional learning models. I think that's been years of work. It's been absolutely essential and it works really well. Even if it's just a tiny experience, it doesn't have to be like a 2 week long institute, which I love those. Believe me, I love a good 2 week summer institute. But even if it's just a 1 hour webinar,
Mhm.
like we're doing now during this pandemic, to give them enough of a taste, a dip their toe into what it feels like to be a student learning in this way can be transformative for a teacher. And we also have been working with administrators similarly to help them experience what the learning is, to actually get a science AP or even a principal to do a science activity from the perspective of a science learner and say, oh, this is what you're trying to do. Now I see it. Now I can back it. Like now I can give my support for it. What do you need? How can I help? That is like to me the like in teacher ed right now, one of the most important things that I think works and we need to continue doing no matter what.
Do you think, just coming off of that, have you seen wholesale buy-in to that in teacher ed or professional learning that's being developed for teachers now, or do you feel like that's still just in certain pockets and we should really be pushing that to be more widespread for teachers?
I think it's becoming more widespread for certainly more than it was when I was becoming a teacher.
Mhm.
I was again privileged enough that when I became a teacher, I immediately, I think it was my either in my first or second year in the classroom, immediately was able to be part of curriculum-based professional learning that included immersion in the science curriculum materials. I was very lucky that New York City had became part of the piloting of an inquiry-based PBIS from It's About Time, and Mary Starr was my PD provider, and I remember she had me do the science activities, and then I had to go teach them, and it was grounded in high quality instructional materials that were consistent with reform efforts at the time. And so again, I had that privilege. So I don't even know what it's like to be a teacher that doesn't have access to high quality materials, access to professional learning that includes immersion. So now that I have been doing this work for a while, I do recognize that a lot of teachers don't have access to either of those things. And those are two critical ingredients to success with this work. And so um, I think that that is something that while we're seeing shift and we're seeing increasing buy-in that immersion is necessary, the external constraints around time and money are always a barrier and always a factor. And so I do think that's absolutely a battle we need to continue to fight. And this is something we need to continue to advocate for. But I've also seen a lot of progress. I think that when we get teachers and administrators in our workshops, there's more familiarity with this professional learning model around having you do the science
Yeah.
and then learn about the science teaching of those things after having done some of it. So I'm seeing more and more of it, but we're not totally there yet.
I totally agree. Yeah. And Jules, if I could just say what I'm taking away from that is to really think about the interventions that we need that advance student learning. We know what the shifts are, but we need that mindset shift in those who are responsible for that teaching and learning in order for to
Exactly.
see those shifts in the classrooms.
And we know from students learning too, in order to have that shift, you have to experience it for yourself. It's really hard to be told about something. And that's so parallel to the shift in science education itself around students having to figure out things in science for themselves and to have that sense of epistemic agency, um, rather than the teacher having all the agency over what counts as science and so on in the classroom. Students need to have those transformative experiences. So it's the same for teachers. Teachers need to have those transformative experiences as well to understand what we up here are trying to get them to do. That's an approach that doesn't work.
Yeah. Do you think, considering where science education was pre-pandemic, um, can you think of any things that educators could do to support students who have unfinished learning and, to be frank, disrupted schooling and are coming back into classrooms hopefully over the next year, or either in virtual classrooms now? We don't know exactly what the instructional landscape is going to look like for a while now. What approaches do you think that we should really be holding on to support student learning in this unprecedented situation that we're in education right now?
I think that a lot of the work that we were already doing around NGSS shifts can actually help teachers address that right now. And it pains me when I see on various listservs or on social media teachers saying that they're going to take a break from NGSS in order to go back to what they were doing before because it's easier and the kids don't need that right now. And then they go back to these traditional approaches rather than recognizing that by actually focusing on phenomena driven instruction and like focusing what's relevant in terms of phenomena to kids right now, that I think actually can help people. And I have seen teachers see that in some of the commentary as well, where I saw one teacher post something that said something like what that NGSS was like saving her right now. And so I think for me, it's that kids, whether they're in school or not, are out there or in the world,
Yeah.
and they have knowledge and they have experiences, and we have an opportunity pre-pandemic, now, or after the pandemic, to connect to their real life experiences. We have a routine around phenomena where after we've introduced the phenomena in a unit or a lesson, to have students share related phenomena, right? Where students can actually share, what does this remind you of? Is this like something else that you're familiar with? And I think those kinds of routines are so critical, again, before this happened, now and after, that will help. I think it's not necessarily about catching them up and being behind or not. It's that the science they're learning has to be relevant or has to help them make meaning of their natural world. So I think that's the NGSS piece that I hope teachers hold on to now during the pandemic to help them after.
Love that idea. It's not about catching them up. Um, specifically
And
if, go ahead,
it's
please.
and I was just gonna say, it's a whole generation. All the kids are going through this collectively.
Right.
And there are, of course, going to be further inequities and there's going to be bigger gaps for sure. But every kid is everyone, this is a worldwide phenomenon right now. And so my hope is that the system, higher ed, whatever, like recognizes that this whole generation of kids are going through this
Mhm.
and that the system then supports them as opposed to it being the responsibility of the individual school or teacher to fix this, and rather have the system hold this for us. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And also just brings up the power of how you're thinking about quality experiences for learning. And if the trade-off to catch a student up is to decrease the quality of the instruction or to change the ability of students to engage with instruction in an authentic way, then what are we really catching them up to? Right.
yeah, we will further the inequities if
Mhm.
we revert back and focus on catch up and start rewarding um, what would now be considered like racist practices in the classroom,
Mhm.
right? Like pushing memorization, pushing for coverage.
Yeah.
We're actually interpreting now as uh, we're trying to push against that in anti-racist curriculum work now, right? So by trying to revert back to those traditional approaches, it's going to push those inequities. So yeah.
Definitely. Well, speaking of things that could cause harm, from your experience, you kind of spoke to what you know works. What are some things that you just actually know they just do not work and they can cause harm to students? And it's things that we should really keep away from and considering intervention and just pushing and supporting science learning in general.
Yeah, so I think I already started to allude to this, but pushing for coverage, I think does harm. I think pushing for checking off boxes, did I catch everything for an exam that already is problematic, that might even be canceled, just to speak to New York State, is
Mhm.
painful to me right now, and we know it doesn't work. Pushing uh, pushing success defined as like where memorization is what is evidence of success is problematic, and we know it doesn't work. Pushing for just vocab prior to experience, we know doesn't work. And that's a big one in science explicitly. I feel like I'm still fighting the battle to help non-science ed people understand that front loading vocabulary is very problematic in science, particularly for English language learners who have no um, concept of the thing that they're attaching the word to. So until you have that experience, the word is meaningless. And it's about memorization again. And again, you're going to further those inequities. I think another thing we know doesn't work that I've already referenced is a top-down approach. Whether it's district pushing teachers to do something, teachers trying to get the kids to do something, rather than trying to put the agency on the learners to figure things out. I think isn't a like that's something I hope that whether it's superintendents or whatever trying to push new initiatives downwards. Um, we know those approaches don't work, and we still do them. It's
Yeah.
very painful. Not acknowledging trauma, I think we know doesn't work. It's there whether we acknowledge it or not,
Yes.
and we can pretend that the kids are fine or that the teachers are fine or even that the administrators are fine, but nobody's fine. And so until we like acknowledge that, I don't know how anyone can learn. So really making sure that we're building in routines for SEL for the SEL work right now, I think is essential. And to get specific about science, we I still see, even after years and years of work, teachers struggling to understand that if they're the ones explaining something to a student, then they're the ones that are going to understand it, not the student. And so I think, I feel like in some ways, even in this interview, all the things that I've explained to you about my thinking are going to be really helpful to me.
Mhm.
Right? Like, because as we express things and talk about things and process our ideas, we are the one who is talking is the one who is learning.
Yeah.
And so, like, this is going to benefit me. I do hope that if someone reads this and watches this, it benefits them. But we know that there needs to be some other type of sense making activity around what you're listening to or watching or reading. And that's true in classrooms. Teachers can't just explain science or have students watch videos of them explaining something to children and expect that students are just going to absorb it like a sponge. That's just not how learning works. We know after years of this work that teachers still come to us and say, I just don't understand why they got it wrong on the state exam. I know I taught that, right? We've heard this for years. I know I
Years.
covered that. I know I explained it, and I explained it really well this year. I know I did a really good lesson that day. And it's not about how well you explained it to the kids. It's about the students explaining it, right? It's about the discourse between students. So that's the last thing. I think it's probably true in all disciplines, but I think it's particularly necessary in science right now for us not to lose the idea that the person doing the talking and the sense making is the person doing the learning.
That is so key, and such a thing to almost run away from in a time
It's
where we're
hard.
trying to figure out, how to engage with students and how to make sure they can engage back with us, and how to make sure we're available to them, and knowledge is available to them. And I think that's really something that is key to uplift and really put at the center, to ask ourselves the question, like, how can we make sure we're giving students the opportunity to explain the science to us? Because that's when we know that they have it, not that we have it, that they have it when they can
And
explain.
it's about the kids. It's why we write student centered
Yes.
in terms of our curriculum approaches, our professional learning approaches, everything we're doing, we're trying to put students at the center.
Awesome. Well, that is all that I have to ask you today. Thank you so much, Dora. I so appreciate it. I've been so excited. I love this Rethinking Intervention series. And
Yeah, thank you guys for
time
doing this.
to have some science voices in this series. And the funny thing is that you just see across the board, you see trends. Um,
Hmm.
about what good learning is and what students need in order to be able to really truly, like you talked about at the beginning, to get that conceptual understanding. That means that they know. So it's been great talking to you today, Dora. I
You
appreciate it.
too. Thank you again so much for having me.